Hello and good evening. I'm Don Arleth and coming to you live from Warsaw. You're watching World News Tonight here on TVP World. It took just a few hours at the beginning of the week for Ukraine to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Now that the ball is in Russia's court, the situation has become more complicated. After a high-level meeting on Thursday between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Vladimir Putin, it still remains unclear whether Russia will agree and engage in peace talks. Meanwhile, the fighting continues on the front lines and the war drags on. We'll have more on this latest dynamic of developments in just a minute, but first, the latest headlines. The EU extends sanctions on Russia amid internal tensions. J.D. Vance doubts Trump would support moving nuclear weapons further east in Europe. And Greenland tells Trump enough is enough over U.S. annexation talk. After Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire on Monday, come Friday, and we still don't have a definitive answer from the Kremlin, despite U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff meeting with Vladimir Putin on Thursday. Donald Trump said on social media that the end of this bloody war is finally near. But does the U.S. president really know how difficult it is to reach an agreement with his Russian counterpart? Piotr Miszczuk has more.
After Ukraine agreed to the US-brokered 30-day ceasefire deal with Russia, which now awaits Russian President Putin's approval, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that all Kremlin responses to a potential truce are simply serving Putin's agenda.
We have heard the predictable, manipulative words from Putin in response to the idea of a frontline ceasefire. He's already laying the groundwork for rejection. Putin is, of course, afraid to tell President Trump outright that he wants to prolong this war and continue killing Ukrainians. Instead, in Moscow, they surround the idea of a ceasefire with preconditions designed to make it impossible or at least delay it for as long as possible.
Zelensky's words come after Putin said he's open to ceasefire talks.
I think that we need to talk about this with our American colleagues, call President Trump, discuss it together.
Though US President Donald Trump still hasn't sat at the negotiating table with Putin, his special envoy Steve Witkoff spoke to Putin on Thursday. Following the discussions, President Trump took to his platform Truth Social and hailed them as productive. He also stated he made a special request to Putin.
At this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. I've strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one not seen since World War II.
In a similar vein, late on Thursday, US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz expressed hope the talks will end in an armistice, given progress in the negotiations with both sides.
We do have some cautious optimism. Of course, both sides will have their demands, and of course, both sides are going to have to make some compromises.
But those assertions have been met with a rather tepid reaction in Europe. Poland's former president and anti-communist movement icon Lech Wałęsa remarked that any potential deal will be to Ukraine's disadvantage.
I'm afraid they will force Ukraine to make a poor compromise, only that again, looking at it logically, it will be a waste of 6 to 10 years according to my calculations, and then it will all turn around. If we don't defend democracy, demagogues and populists will set the world on fire.
Despite the ongoing talks, Russia continues to shell Ukraine. Early on Friday, Russia launched a drone attack on a hospital in the Kharkiv region, injuring one medical worker.
When looking at supporters of Ukraine within the European Union, Budapest and Kyiv are like oil and water. To much surprise, and after days of intense negotiating, Hungary finally supports extending EU sanctions against thousands of Russian individuals. So how was Viktor Orban persuaded to cross the line? Our EU correspondent in Brussels, Angela Skujins, has the answer.
After almost 20 hours of backroom negotiations, the impossible was achieved. On Friday morning at 10 a.m, news broke that all the ambassadors from across the 27 EU member states voted to renew EU sanctions against Russian and Belarusian individuals. Now, 2,400 names are on that list, most of which are Russian, and they've been targeted since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They've been hit with frozen assets as well as travel bans. Now, there was consternation regarding Hungary. That leader, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, previously threatened to torpedo any EU measure that was critical of the Kremlin, but their ambassador was pulled across the line today, and we found out from our own sources that this occurred due to 7 names being removed from that sanction list. Questions are hovering, though, regarding whether all of the EU member states will have to bow to the will of Hungary to get EU measures across the line. Now, a reporter asked the European Commission, this is the EU executive, this very question at a press conference on Friday morning.
We cannot comment as such on the sanctions and how we do. What we want to achieve through it is to ensure that our purpose of sanctions is undermining Russia's ability to finance and sustain its war against Ukraine. And when it comes to the specificities of the names mentioned, this is also part of confidential deliberations between member states.
It has become increasingly clear that the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, does not want to support any EU instruments that are critical of the Kremlin. This was catalysed at a recent extraordinary European Council summit, which was aimed at giving Ukraine some much-needed military support on the front lines. The aim was to support the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, on the battlefield and in the sky so we could go to those negotiating table with strength. But we know that Hungary blocked that measure with its veto power. This is why the High Representative Kaja Kallas expects to bring it back to those 27 EU member states' heads. She wants to see if they can buy into this measure without the need of getting that unanimous EU support. This will occur at another European Council summit scheduled for next week. So we'll wait and see whether this will be an enduring trend from the EU to leave Hungary out in the cold to get Ukraine the very much needed military support it deserves. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
Talk of a nuclear deterrent for Poland has gained a lot of traction since the inauguration of U.S. President Donald Trump. But is it conceivable the U.S. would extend the nuclear umbrella over the Central European country and deploy nuclear weapons? Polish President Andrzej Duda recently said, "I think it's not only that the time has come, but that it would be safer if those weapons were already here." However, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has a very different view. Therefore, Poland may have to look a bit closer to home for such added security. Marek Steele has the story.
President Andrzej Duda's proposal for Poland to host U.S. nuclear weapons has not gained traction in Washington.
I haven't talked to the president about that particular issue, but I would be shocked if he was supportive of nuclear weapons extending further east into Europe. We have got to be careful.
The idea presented by the Polish president in the Financial Times was not consulted with the U.S., and the way it was put forward was criticized by the government in Warsaw.
Not surprised that Vice President Vance would say this. We've all heard him in the last 2 months say all sorts of things that would suggest that this is his line. He is not very favorably disposed to the U.S. engagement in European defense.
A similar request by Warsaw to include Poland in its U.S. nuclear sharing program was rejected by the Biden administration 3 years ago.
None of the countries that joined NATO after 1989 actually hosts any of these weapons at the moment.
A deal signed between NATO and Russia in 1997 forbids such deployments.
The member states of NATO reiterate that they have no intention, no plan and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of new members.
However, several provisions of this deal have been breached over the years.
Sending them further east would certainly be a change of policy. It would be seen as a more aggressive stance towards Russia. And obviously, the current American administration isn't interested in taking aggressive stances towards Russia.
Instead, Warsaw could take part in France's nuclear umbrella, a proposal recently made by President Macron.
It would mean nuclear weapons being deployed to Poland. It would mean, for technical reasons, it would have to mean the aircraft that can carry the French nuclear missiles being based in Poland.
France has a nuclear arsenal of roughly 300 warheads. Unlike the UK, which relies on US support, France maintains full sovereignty over its nuclear deterrence.
In just over 2 months, Poles will choose a new president. The campaigns are well underway as candidates vie for the top spot. So who are the key players and what's at stake? Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Dahmen, breaks it down for us in this report.
The race is on to Poland's presidential palace. Will it be centrist frontrunner and Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski, Karol Nawrocki from the opposition right-wing Law and Justice Party, driving a Eurosceptic and nationalist agenda? Or the dark horse, the far-right, libertarian and anti-Ukrainian Sławomir Mencen?
Trzaskowski is likely to win, but it's not a highway to victory, and there is still a chance he's going to lose, and I think it's going to be, in the end, very close to 50-50 election.
This is a crunch vote for the country's governing coalition as Prime Minister Donald Tusk faces a paralysing cohabitation with President Andrzej Duda, who cannot run again after 2 consecutive 5-year terms.
It's extremely important to have a president in your own camp because the president has such a huge negative power. Basically, you need 3/5 to reject the veto of the president at the parliament.
The coming months will also determine whether Poland remains a key European player and Ukraine's staunch ally.
The end of the war in Ukraine must be one that the Ukrainians themselves agree to, and that Putin cannot sell this as his success.
That's Rafał Trzaskowski, who's on the same page as Tusk, keeping Poland embedded in the European Union and close to the US, while pushing for Ukraine's integration into the EU and NATO. But Karol Nawrocki has other ideas, embracing Trump's rebellion against the old global order and tapping into growing discontent over Ukrainian refugees and historical grievances.
I do not see Ukraine in any structure, neither in the European Union nor in NATO, until such important civilizational issues for Poles are resolved.
The strategy has unsettled some of Law and Justice's typically Russia-critical supporters, even appearing to irk President Duda, who has distanced himself from Nawrocki's campaign. In fact, that campaign came under the microscope on Friday as reports emerged that Nawrocki had quietly visited Moscow in 2018, 4 years after Russia annexed Crimea, which he was quick to defend.
I was in Moscow as the director of the Museum of the Second World War. I visited the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, where I clearly stated that World War II broke out in 1939, not in 1941, as was shown at that exhibition.
Some suggest that a weak Nawrocki campaign has opened the door for Sławomir Mencen of the far-right Confederation.
We're sending weapons, money and social benefits to Ukraine. Ukrainians get free healthcare in Poland while Poles must pay. And in return, slander, insults and no gratitude. They treat us like fools.
Mencen has rebranded himself for the social media age, echoing Russian narratives as he draws in young and disillusioned voters. And polls suggest it's working, with Mencen creeping up on Nawrocki, even passing him in some counts, as Trzaskowski holds the lead.
I think that voters of Law and Justice have a huge cognitive dissonance at the moment, seeing the Trump's pivot to Russia, not Asia anymore, but to Russia, while we know the anti-Russian stance that peace, meaning Law and Justice, has always had.
On May 18, the country heads to the ballot box, and if no single candidate gets over 50%, the top 2 will battle it out in a final runoff on the 1st of June. Aaron Dahmen, TVP World.
In Budapest, the Hungarian opposition is gearing up for mass protests against Viktor Orban and his ruling Fidesz party. The top opposition party, TISA, led by Peter Magyar, is gaining ground and poses a major threat to Viktor Orban's almost 15 years in power. Paweł Trzaskowski has more in this report.
Saturday is the day of a national holiday here in Hungary, and this is the day where all the major political forces in the country used to make their voices heard. Among them, Viktor Orban, the country's prime minister and the leader of the ruling Fidesz party, who is going to deliver a state address here in Budapest. However, this year, Viktor Orban's state address is going to be challenged, and is going to be challenged by the demonstration of the TISA party. The TISA party was founded by a former Fidesz politician, Peter Magyar, and is going to hold an anti-government demonstration here as well.
People turning away from the government on the one hand and from other opposition parties on the other. Peter Magyar is a very popular person and he's a good fighter. His main strength is that he is dealing with the everyday problems of the people, with the very bad shape of healthcare, with questions of the education, with emerging growing prices and many others. And he is going around in the country. He has made several rounds going to the smallest villages, speaking directly to people, and he has a growing attendance, so I'm looking forward with great interest to his speech tomorrow.
Currently, TISA is leading some polls ahead of Fidesz, a feat unseen since Viktor Orban took power in 2010. Their demonstrations drew tens of thousands in 2024, and tomorrow's is expected to do the same. We will be here to cover these events for you. From Budapest, Hungary, for TVP World, I'm Paweł Trzaskowski.
And now to Greenland, where the recent words of U.S. President Donald Trump about potential NATO intervention has many there scratching their heads. TVP World correspondent Sonia Gata-Biszczan is still there and on the ground and able to get the reactions from locals.
Greenland's outgoing prime minister held an urgent meeting of party leaders on Friday to show a united front against the most recent threat coming from the United States President Donald Trump.
We, all party leaders, cannot accept the repeated statements about annexation and control of Greenland.
Most recently, in a meeting alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump said that he thinks the annexation of Greenland, self-governing territory of Denmark, will happen.
I'm sitting with a man that could be very instrumental. You know, Mark, we need that for international security, not just security, international.
Nuuk's residents shared with us their feelings about the latest threats coming from Trump.
Scared, a little bit, and confused about our future in Greenland.
And we don't want Donald Trump here in Greenland. No, thank you.
When I asked Member of Parliament Pippo Klinge how often do such meetings like the one on Friday happen, she said that the last one in her memory happened during the COVID pandemic, reflecting the gravitas of this situation.
I think many people are considering where should we go if we're invaded. Should we go to Denmark? Should we go to Norway, Faroe Islands, Iceland? Do we lose our language? Do we lose our culture? It's a very mysterious threat.
One of the Nuuk residents we spoke to said she would feel safer if Denmark and NATO stood up for Greenland more. However, NATO's Secretary General instead stepped back and said he would not engage in the discussion on whether Greenland should become part of the United States, not to drag NATO into it.
He should have made it very clear that you cannot annex anyone, you cannot overthrow a government, and that Trump should respect the Greenlandic government.
Danish foreign minister dismissed the allegations that Greenland would become part of the United States, adding that the recent elections suggest that it would stay part of the Danish Commonwealth for a while. On Saturday, Nuuk residents are planning a march from the city center to the U.S. Embassy to assert that Greenland is not for sale. From Nuuk, for TVP World, Sonia Gata-Biszczan.
Although Ukraine has agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, Moscow is dragging its feet. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had talks with Vladimir Putin on Thursday. However, we still don't know whether Russia will sign off on the plan. In the meantime, the war rages on with daily attacks in both directions, pressure is on all along the front lines, including the Kursk salient. Joining me now to discuss the latest political developments and the threats along the front lines is Senior Fellow at the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, Nico Lang. Hello, Nico, and thank you very much for joining us on World News tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, now 30-day ceasefire. Will Russia agree will it agree without any major preconditions? Because we've heard a long list of issues that it already has.
And many people these days do not have experience with Soviet diplomacy anymore, but the Soviet diplomacy approach is what we are seeing. So you say yes, but what you mean is no, and then you say yes, but there's a little nuance, and the little nuance is Ukraine has to give up, and then I may be ready for ceasefire and peace. So I do not expect Putin to agree with anything. And the question for me is, now that Trump's plan is not really working, what will he do next?
Well, right. I mean, the pressure has been on Ukraine here now for several weeks, especially since this really loud meeting in the Oval Office. So is it time now for the focus to switch squarely on Russia? And do you think it's possible that the Trump administration can now take a tougher approach?
I think, first of all, you have to give Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership credit for sticking together and for working this out, and also for jumping over their shadow. Because, I mean, it's really tough. If you have been treated like this, then writing a letter and apologizing, you have to really put the interest of your country first. And I think Ukraine managed to repair the relationship and to just be friendly and say yes, so that the spotlight would move from Ukraine to Russia. And I think that is where the pressure should be, to pressure Putin and Russia to agree to a ceasefire and to move towards peace. I'm just afraid that the only move that Donald Trump has so far, which is threatening bringing the oil prices down, might be not enough, and it might also not be fast enough to really get Putin on the table.
Right. Well, they did put the sanctions on the European countries to not do those deals that they had previously done with Russia. So I guess that's encouraging from one side. But now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the current situation on the front line. There is a lot of pressure in several directions, namely in Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, and then, of course, we have the situation in Kursk, which we can get to in a minute. But looking at the current situation on the front line, and if we can imagine a 30-day ceasefire, what do you think both sides would do with their troops and their militaries in the event of such a ceasefire?
The situation at the front lines has been mixed over the last weeks, because Ukraine was able to have successful counterattacks near Pokrovsk, in Toretsk, a city where the Russians already thought they are through, but Ukraine is pushing them back now, also in Chasiv Yar and near Kupiansk. At the same time, Russia was successfully pushing the Ukrainians in Sucha in Kursk Oblast, and Ukraine now, I think, is about to leave Kursk Oblast completely. By the way, the weird story about thousands of Ukrainian troops being encircled is not true. It's an invention. But Ukraine has been under pressure there. It will be very difficult to really have a ceasefire because there is no line of contact. If you travel there, if you really see it, it's like a zone of 25, 30 kilometers with drones flying around. It's a death zone. So it will be really difficult to enforce a ceasefire on the ground. That's why the initial suggestion that was also initiated by France and the UK was to say, let's have a ceasefire in the air, on sea, because on land it will be really difficult. But as I said already, I don't think Russia will agree anyway.
Right. Even Vladimir Putin raised that issue with Steve Witkoff. Well, and also, you know, this situation which they claim that Donald Trump actually said that he requested of Vladimir Putin to spare the lives of the Ukrainians who are surrounded there. What do you think the true extent of Kursk is? Do you think it's time that the Ukrainians will withdraw?
Well, there is already very good reporting about this. I also talked to Ukrainians who have been involved. There's also satellite images that you can watch. So some of the retreat from the Kursk salient was chaotic on the Ukrainian side, but some of it was well managed. So the Ukrainians are retreating. There are pockets where there are a couple of soldiers who are retreating by foot, but there is no thousands of Ukrainians being encircled, which is not really possible to encircle somebody on the territory anyway. This is more like stories from the Second World War or from the past. It seems that there have been Russian war bloggers talking about this a couple of days ago, and that has been spread in the news, as it often is the case, unverified. But maybe also Putin raised this with Witkov, and it's like a theater being played, you know, telling the story that there are Ukrainians encircled and giving the gift of letting them pass, and Trump is playing along. It's a distraction from the ceasefire proposal. And maybe Putin is giving this distraction, talking about something else. Again, classic move of Soviet diplomacy.
One thing I'm really encouraged by, or was encouraged by, in Jeddah at the beginning of the week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that if Russia doesn't agree to the ceasefire, then we will know who is the impediment to peace. Does this firmly, in your opinion, put the ball into Russia's court? And now Russia is the one that has to act?
Yeah, but let's be honest. I mean, you and I, everybody knows that the impediment to peace has been Russia since 2014 when they attacked Ukraine. And
I know, but for Marco Rubio to say this, is this something that's not significant coming out of everything that we've heard?
Yeah, but it just shows that I think wrongly the US administration put itself in a position saying, oh, there are two parties in war and we have to be a mediator. But it has never been two parties in war. It has been Russia attacking Ukraine. So, but you are right. I think if the focus now is on pressuring Russia, that is where it belongs. Because Russia can end this war any day. Putin has just to stop his aggression. The question is, what is the consequence now? Will there be more sanctions? Will there be sanctions against the Russian ships selling the oil? Will there be military pressure? Will there be more US military deliveries to Ukraine to show the Russians really you have to give in now? For now, we heard from Waltz that there will be shuttle diplomacy. But what is there to shuttle? I think the Ukrainians, they can surrender without Trump and his administration. They can do this anytime if they want to. So more pressure on the Ukrainian side will not bring us closer to a ceasefire.
Right. Well, hopefully it's the other way around. Hopefully it's more pressure on the Russian side. Rubio also said that a certain foreign minister from Europe told him that the war should continue until the end of the year to degrade the Russian economy further and put Ukraine in a position of strength. Now, do you agree or disagree with the statement of this anonymous European foreign minister?
Who could that be?
Geez, I wonder.
Well, I think it's not so easy to speculate on when the economic fallout will really hit the Russian Federation. It's clear for Putin the war is a money issue mainly. He doesn't care for human lives, but it's not an existential money issue for now. He has revenues. So unless I think Russia is really pushed by lower oil prices and by less possibilities to sell their raw materials to third parties, then it will be very difficult to really exercise pressure. What we see is, though, that Russia is militarily beatable. I mean, they have to retreat now near Pokrovsk and near Toretsk, and what they achieved after 3 years of war is not very impressive. They did not reach their military goals, but I think then military pressure needs to be part of it. If the war continues, we need to equip Ukraine with the necessary weapons and ammunition to put pressure on Russia, and I think this will help to really get Putin to the table.
The resumption of intelligence sharing is also something mentioned at the beginning of the week, as well as the weapons deliveries, despite us seeing in the media that some of these platforms that were set up in the Rzeszów airport have been dismantled. Do you think the U.S. is going to continue these weapons deliveries, or at least until we get some movement on the Russian side?
Yeah, I think some damage has been done. Everybody is asking themselves the question, can the United States of America be trusted? Is this now a temporary solution, or will they next week turn around and say, oh, we thought about this again, we will stop the help, we will stop the intelligence assistance? I think we have to work on alternatives. And the truth is also, the Europeans should not only watch Trump TV, the Europeans should get deliveries to Ukraine, finance the Ukrainian defense industry, which can do much more, and also get much stronger with their military posture themselves, because we cannot rely that the United States will now continue. There are some alternatives to intelligence sharing. There are also European satellite pictures that can be part of it. But to be honest, some weapons, some ammunition, some intelligence instruments, we don't have them as Europeans, and we have to close those capability gaps as soon as we can to be strategically more able to help ourselves and Ukraine.
Well, let's hope that comes sooner than later. Nico Lang, Senior Fellow at the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Do stay tuned because Face to Face with Michał Broniatowski and Adam Yasser is coming up next. Goodbye.